To start off, it always is an honor to speak at the NSCA, and I do consider the NSCA personal trainers the elite of the industry, so you guys really are leading the way, leading the field, and really that, for me as an educator, it is my honor to speak in front of you. And today we're going to talk about a topic that is quite near and dear to me, the science of squatting. I've written several papers on this. I did a review paper, which I'll reference towards the end, in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research back in 2010, which was on kinematics and kinetics of squatting. And I've done a bunch of SCJ articles related to the topic. One of my hobby horses is on squatting depth. How low should you go? And we will certainly be getting into that topic as we come along here. And by the way, I put this guy's face on Doug's body, so thank you, Doug. So first of all, why are we even talking about this? Why squat? And the squat is the king of all exercises, and certainly in my book it is. First of all, it is related to activities of daily living. Every time we sit down and get up, we are squatting. How many times a day do we do that? You guys just did it, right? When we go to lift packages, to pick up a child, squatting is essential to what we are in our everyday lives, and certainly it should be. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's kind of left by the wayside where people they have trouble getting out of that chair, right? It also is essential to athletics, and research clearly shows a direct relationship between squatting ability, so the ability to exert force, and jumping, sprinting, and all sorts of other athletic endeavors. So it's an extremely important aspect from a functional perspective. And when we talk about functional, that word is bastardized within our industry, but I think it is very important to understand that when we're talking about functional here, it's our ability to carry out things that we need to do. That's what function is about. And that will vary from individual to individual. There is no one functional way to go. I can safely say that we all do need to squat. It also is extremely important from a muscular standpoint. Sarcopenia, which is the age-related loss of muscle, is endemic in our society. There are over 200 muscles activated in the squat, along with the deadlift. It really is the most muscle-activated exercise there is. Why is that important? Well, first of all, just from a general sarcopenia, we know that hypertrophy is related to the ability to activate muscles. If you don't activate a muscle, it can't grow. And if you're not activating muscles, ultimately the use it or lose it principle says we're going to lose it. So the squat, either dynamically, certainly in the lower body, or statically in virtually all our upper body musculature, so many major muscles are activated. And also there are metabolic benefits. So if we want to help a client from a weight loss perspective, studies have shown that there is a direct correlation between the amount of muscle mass that is activated and the direct calorie expenditure related to that exercise. So if you can increase the amount of muscle activated, you will increase metabolic activity. By activating over 200 muscles, squats are one of the best metabolic movements. And if you're ever doing any metabolic training, certainly including movements like the squat will help to facilitate a weight loss program. So I'm going to get into some functional anatomy here. Some of this might be a review. I'm sure for many of you, it'll be a basic review. For others, maybe you don't know this stuff. Extremely important to understand your functional anatomy if you're going to talk about any type of movement. And I'm going to go on a joint-by-joint basis. So the squat, we're talking, it's triple extension, right? When we squat, we're extending at the hips, at the knees, and the ankles. And we're also having the spine, the trunk muscles are heavily activated. So we'll talk about the spinal column too. So first from the hip joint, the hip is a ball and socket joint. We have the acetabulum, which is the socket, and the head of the femur, which is the ball, and they fit into one another to carry out activity. It is freely mobile as a ball and socket joint, allows mobility in all movement planes, just as the shoulder does. So as we know, the squat is a sagittal plane movement, or should be. Sometimes when we see people squatting, they kind of are using multiple planes, which we'll talk about, and they certainly shouldn't be. But the squat would be flexion and extension, which is the sagittal plane movements. As we're descending, you're getting flexion at the joints. As you're coming up, you are getting extension. But there also, we need to control AB and adduction, and we need to control rotation as we're doing a squat. If not, we're getting stuff like this going on as we're squatting. Interestingly, and as most of you who have seen or if you have seen my previous presentations, you will know that I am an evidence-based practitioner. Everything I'm going to impart to you today is based upon the research, but evidence-based practice, contrary to what people think, is not simply taking research and saying, okay, well, this is what the research shows, so this is what we got to do. But it's the application of research with personal experience and then applying it to the individual. So what I hope to accomplish today is to make you understand research. And by the way, there's always going to be limitations in research. When you've read as much research as I have, you will know not only do we not know a lot of stuff, but so often the research is very conflicting. So what you see in one aspect, you get one reading from one study, you're going to see the exact opposite or something approaching that in another study. We need to balance that. We need to look at what was the methodology of the study, who were the subjects being studied. And there are so many factors. People often will throw, and you see this done with the magazines all the time, well, they want to capture a headline and they want to promote a certain way of training, and they'll throw out a research study and say, hey, look, this shows this proves, which is one of my big bugaboos, because research never proves anything. It just lends support to a given idea or a given theory. But we need to stay away from that. And what I'm going to do today is give you a research-based, if you will, because everything I do is based on research, but then also give you applications and look at where some of the gaps in this research is. So studies do show that hip torque increases with increased knee flexion. So the lower you go, generally you're getting increased hip torque. Now, there are some studies showing that it peaks at 90 degrees, others do not. Maximal torque tends to occur near the bottom phase. There is some discrepancies in the literature there. Certainly it has been shown that a forward lean, as you start leaning forward, is positively correlated with increased forces. And why? Well, you increase the hip flexion as you're coming down. So if you're increasing the hip flexion as you're coming up, there's going to be greater extension torques. Now, when it comes to musculature, and this is going to be some interesting stuff here, we do know that the gluteus maximus exhibits a positive relationship as far as activity with increasing squat depth to a degree. However, the most quoted study on this was done by Caterizano. And actually, Brett Contreras mentioned this in his lecture yesterday, and very rightly so. The real issue I have with the study itself, and it was carried out well, but they used the same load to measure different squat depths. So they took a quarter squat, a parallel squat, and then a full squat, and they looked at the EMG activity. What are we getting as far as activation of the glute musculature? And this study is the one that is quoted really throughout by all of the professionals when you're hearing how much glute activation is there. And what the study showed was that at each, as you keep going down, so there was, I think it was 16% MVC here, 28% here, and 35% here. So you're getting about 20% greater glute muscle activity at the lowest phase of the squat compared to a parallel. That sounds pretty good, right? However, what is not correlated there? The load. So can I squat this low with the same load that I would squat this low? No. So the question then becomes, would there be differences in activation if I were to load properly? Would I be able to get the same glute activity if you got an RM that was specific to the loading range? And that we don't know. That has not been done, and that might be something that we look to do in the future. But there's certainly, just from a applied physiology standpoint, logically you would think there is a reason that you might get greater glute activity, and we always look at logic when we try to design studies, because the glutes are hip extensors, and if you're getting greater flexion, you're going to get greater extension on the way up. So this is something we'll talk about. Interestingly, and it's often talked about, well, I get a lot of hamstring work because I do a lot of squats. The hamstrings are only very moderately active in a squat. Why do you think that is? Yeah, well, the hamstrings are a biarticular muscle. They cross the knee joint as well as the hip joint. What do the hamstrings do? Well, they are hip extensors. We know that. What do they do with the knee? They're a knee flexor. Let's take a look at what's happening. As we're coming down, we're flexing at the knee and flexing at the hip, right? So you're stretching here, you're shortening here. What happens on the way up? You are shortening here, flexing here. So, I'm sorry, other way. You're shortening here and you're flexing here. So the bottom line is the hamstrings, really, their functional length barely changes throughout the move. You're getting the same length-tension relationship throughout that movement, whereas you're not, whereas the glutes are, you're exhibiting a dynamic movement throughout, a shortening action and a lengthening action. So the hamstrings, really, the activity levels are 50% at best of that of the glute max. This, and from a practical standpoint, what do you think that means? Well, that means that you need to specifically work the hamstring muscles with direct hamstring work. Romanian deadlifts, knee curls. You want to be training the hamstrings to make sure that you are balancing out, because we'll talk about the knee in a minute, but the quadricep muscles, primary knee extensors, can get a lot stronger than the hamstrings because of that. And what does that do? That exacerbates the potential for injury, and that's been pretty clearly shown in the literature, that when you start getting significant imbalances between quads and hams, and this is especially true with your athletes. A lot of people are not exerting themselves in a way that that's going to, at least from an injury standpoint, have your everyday clients have specific issues. But certainly those who become more active will predispose themselves towards injury with imbalances. So the knee joint, the knee is really two joints. It is the tibiofemoral joint, which is the articulation of the tibia and the femur. That is a modified hinge joint. There is a small amount of rotation involved, but for all intents and purposes, it is a hinge joint, just flexes and extends. We also have the patellofemoral joint, which is a gliding joint, and that's the articulation of the patella over the femur. And that the benefit of the patella, the patellofemoral joint, is that it increases leverage at the knee and also helps to protect against wear in the quadriceps tendon. And it's been shown over and over, those who have to get their patellas removed have about 40% of the strength, the knee strength, as those who have a patella. So it's a very important joint. It will have implications. And by the way, I do want you, because towards the end of the presentation, we're going to be discussing ramifications of this. So I'm not just going over this applied anatomy for the sake of educating you. It's obviously important to know this from an educating standpoint, but the application is really what I think is most important, especially to trainers. You guys are practitioners. Your clients don't want to hear about the articulation between the tibia and the femur. At least my clients never did. But what they do want to know is how is this going to, what does this mean to them? And certainly you want to know that in terms of designing your programs. So there are two basic forces that act at the knee. There is compression and shear. Compression is a squeezing force. Two forces coming together to squeeze. This force, compressive forces, are more easily handled by soft tissue structures than shear force, which we'll get into. So the compressive forces at the knee have been shown to increase with increased squat depth. The lower you go, the greater the forces. So both tibiofemoral and patellofemoral forces significantly increase as we keep going lower and lower. Now, these are fairly well handled at the knee joint. And interestingly, the benefit is, there actually is a benefit to these increased forces, because they have been shown to provide a protective effect against the more potentially injurious shear forces that are exerted. So by coming tighter, by getting a more tightly packed knee joint, you theoretically will decrease the amount of shear. The amount, as we'll talk about, shear is a longitudinal force. However, the menisci and the articular cartilage are under great stress, so they are particularly susceptible to compressive forces. As we'll talk about, the ligamental forces here are much more subjected to shear, but the menisci, here you see the meniscus, they're half-moon structures, and they are more susceptible, as well as the articular cartilage, which surrounds the ends of the joints. So shear, as I mentioned, is a force that is applied perpendicular to the long axis. So you're getting a force that's coming in, if this is the joint, it's coming in this way. It is not as well handled by soft tissue structures, and the cruciate ligaments are the ones that are most affected by shear. Cruciate ligaments, their primary purpose is to resist anterior and posterior shear. So those are the two main forces. Anterior shear is primarily handled by the ACL. Now, anterior shear is most evident in the first 30 degrees. It peaks at around 30 degrees and basically diminishes. By the time you're at 60 degrees, anterior shear is almost done. Anterior shear is when you get what's called anterior tibial translation. It's where the tibia starts to pull forward of the femur. And the restraining forces of the ACL help to maintain the integrity of that joint. By the way, the hamstrings, this is just a factoid, but the hamstrings exert a counter-regulatory effect also on these forces. So they actually, the hamstrings help the ACL in preventing anterior tibial translation. This has relevance when you do a leg extension. Since the hamstrings are not active, the ACL is under significantly more stress. Whether that actually has clinically meaningful aspects as far as being potentially more injurious really depends on the client. If that client has had an ACL injury, you need to then really, I'm not saying don't necessarily do leg extensions, but certainly your heavier leg extensions can significantly increase the force of that ligament and potentially become more injurious there. So the ACL does, of the ligaments, provide the majority of that restraining force. Now, posterior forces come in when the anterior forces diminish. So they start to come in around 30 degrees and they peak by 90 degrees. So your posterior forces at 90 degrees, this is another important point. We often think of 90 degrees as being parallel, a parallel squat. No, 90 degrees is about here. A parallel squat is this. That's 110 115 degrees. We're looking at the knee angle. And it is a fallacy. People talk about why squat to 90 degrees as if that's a parallel squat. That is not. So at 90 degrees, the posterior shear peaks. And then after that, it will precipitously decline. Both anterior and posterior shear starts to, anterior shear is out after about 60 degrees. Posterior, once you get to 90, it precipitously declines as you keep going lower. And it's almost non-existent in the lowest portion of the squat. And a lot of that is due to the compressive forces. Remember we talked earlier how these compressive forces pack the knee and they thus really constrain the knee at these lower flexion angles because compression keeps going up as you keep going down. As I'm going down, we're getting more and more compression. Well, that's also preventing that shear. And there are the soft tissue structures of the hamstrings and the gastroc also have been known when they come into contact, they start to contact one another, can also mitigate that. So the PCL is what exerts that kind of regulatory force here. So as far as the knee musculature, the quadriceps have been shown to peak at around 90 degrees. I also want to say that this has been accepted readily until recently. However, some of the more recent studies actually show that as you keep going down, the quadricep forces will continue to increase. So this really does need more study. Some of it is methodological, what the methods that they're using, whether it's EMG versus other means. So it is, certainly we know that at least to get maximal activity in the quads, around 90 degrees should be a minimum. And then if you want to keep optimizing, there is some evidence that going lower can. It is equivocal. Interestingly here, we know that the quadriceps are 4 muscles. We have the 3 vasti muscles, your vastus medialis, lateralis, and intermedius. And we also have the rectus femoris. Well, the vasti muscles are about 50% greater as far as the activity than the rectus. Why? Same reason as the hamstrings. The rectus femoris is the only quadricep muscle that crosses the hip joint. So what does it do? It flexes the hip at the hip, and it extends the knee. What's happening? Let's take a look. I am flexing here, so it's shortening here. It's lengthening here. It's shortening here. It's lengthening here. Again, really does not change its functional length. The ankle joint, and this is one of the more misunderstood areas. A lot of times people discount the forces at the ankle joint. They talk about the knees and the hips, but there are significant forces that are acting at the ankle joint during a squat. So the ankle joint is comprised of 2 primary joints, the talocrural and the talocalcaneal. The talocrural is the articulation of the fibula, the tibia, and the talus. And that is where ankle extension and flexion are carried out, so plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. The talocalcaneal joint primarily is for postural stability, and that's the mobility. So the ankle is going to have a combination of, especially in squatting, of mobility and stability. Your mobility is in the talocrural joint, and the talocalcaneal joint will resist eversion and inversion. Eversion is bringing your feet in, eversion bringing your feet out, the soles of your feet. So what does the literature show here? Well, the ankle joint, again, you have to remember, and the human body is just so cool in how it's designed. How we have muscles that are biarticular or uniarticular, crossing two joints versus one joint. And again, the gastrocnemius, the muscle we often think of as most important in terms of carrying out plantar flexion. Well, it's not nearly as active as the squat. Why? Well, the gastroc is a biarticular muscle. It actually assists in knee flexion as well as carrying out ankle extension. So same thing. You're getting the length tension. The change in length is not nearly as great, whereas the soleus is a uniarticular muscle. It only crosses the ankle joint. Thus, it's going to have the greatest effect. So what does that mean? Well, hey, you want to make sure if you want to maximize gastroc activity, it's not going to happen just through a squat. Throw in some plantar flexion, some straight leg calf raises. Interestingly, the plantar flexors have been shown to be more responsive to load than depth. So if you're going to really load up that bar and kind of do those curtsies you see some people doing, well, within limits, the plantar flexors will get significant, whereas you're probably not going to do very much at the glute area and the quads. The plantar flexors, at least to a degree, will get more from increased loading than the depth aspect. So that leads us to the spine. And this is one of the things that it is one of my hobby horses in terms of how people lift. I know Jim Kilbasso did a great job before, talked about CrossFit a little, and certainly I'm not here to bash anyone's idea of how they want to exercise. And by the way, I do feel that the underlying concept behind CrossFit has a lot of applicability if it's done properly. The problem is it's not, and really that's where I want to go here, is that I see some of the most horrendous things happening in CrossFit type training, where the goal is just to get weight up rather than focusing on form. And the spine is so susceptible to injury. If you do squats properly, you should, I mean, it's a very safe exercise. But when you start seeing people lifting like this and making their back into it, it really is setting people up for injury. And that's why the form is so important here. Well, the spine is 24. We have basically the spine is not one joint, but rather 24 individual joints. Each vertebrae, each articulation of vertebrae is its separate joint. The 12 thoracic joints are kyphotic. The 7 cervical and 5 lumbar are lordotic. So they balance each other out. You have an even distribution of kyphotic and lordotic vertebrae. So that basically that's what gives you that curvature of the spine that we all know. And it does start small on top, so the cervical vertebrae are much smaller than the larger lumbar vertebrae, which are basically from a support purpose. You're supporting a lot more weight down here than you are up here. And what facilitates the movement? Well, it's mostly the intervertebral disc. Boy, I need a drink here. So the intervertebral discs stabilize the spine by anchoring the vertebrae to one another, and they also facilitate multiplanar movement. They allow, basically, the nucleus pulposus, as we'll talk about, functions as a water pillow, which cushions and allows smooth movement. So when you start to have a thinning of the disc, it obviously is going to reduce your movement capabilities. So I like to use the analogy of a jelly donut. I know this has been, you probably have heard this, or if you haven't, you're in for a treat. So I know it's after breakfast already, so I can probably talk about this without your mouth watering. But the nucleus pulposus can be thought of as the jelly that's within the jelly donut. It is a fluid-like structure that functions as a water cushion, basically, and allows for the vertebrae to sit on top of one another without squishing into each other. the nucleus is constrained by an outer layer, which is the annulus fibrosus, and that's like the ring that goes around that jelly donut. And the two end plates sit on top of the one on the top vertebrae and the bottom vertebrae to function as like the top and bottom of the donut. So this is what it looks like. Here's your nucleus. That's the light blue fluid inside. The purple structure here is your annulus. And the end plates sit on top of one another, and that's where it's kind of packing in like that jelly donut. So what does this mean from a practical standpoint? Well, if you squat with a flexed lumbar spine, as we often see people do, it significantly increases the load from the muscles, from the supporting muscles, mostly the spinal erectors, to the passive tissues. And studies show that that significantly increases the potential for disc disease, and especially herniation. Also, what is less known is that I also see people, in trying not to flex, they kind of go the opposite, and they're keeping their back like this when they're squatting. And a simple 2-degree increase in extension from neutral significantly and meaningfully, clinically meaningfully, heightens the compressive forces in the posterior annulus by 16%. So you are significantly increasing the injury either by overextending and certainly by overflexing. Of the two, probably the flexion is going to have the greatest negative effect. So what does proper squat technique entail? It requires a rigid spine that's maintained in neutral position. I'm sure pretty much everyone realizes that intuitively, but when you actually see the way so many people squat, it doesn't translate that way. And we really need to be, no pun intended, but rigid about our form in this respect. Of all the aspects of form, it is the form at the spine, in my humble opinion, that is most important to preventing injury. Remember, our primary job as trainers is to get our clients' results. Our overriding obligation is to not get our clients injured. Getting your clients' results while hastening the onset of injury makes you a bad trainer. And I come from a family of physicians, and I was raised on the Hippocratic Oath, that is, above all, do no harm. Well, as fitness professionals, we need to subscribe to the Hippocratic Oath. Now, the musculature during the spine, the primary resistance to flexion is provided by the spinal erectors, which are muscles that traverse up from the lumbar area to the thoracic area and then even up to the cervical area. And that's maintaining, their job is to maintain an extended spine, keep us erect. What I will say is that the primary reason for failure in most squats, why most people cannot lift, do not achieve their maximum squat, is a failure here, not here. And it should go to reason that way, that the erectors tend to be weaker. Your glutes are very powerful muscles. The quads tend to be very powerful muscles. The erectors tend not to be, and especially our everyday activities that we do are often, certainly we're going to walk around, but we're slouched, we're not using our erectors, and they are going to tend to weaken from everyday activities. We're not talking athletes here, we're talking just everyday people. You're going to tend to have issues, and that lends credence to the importance of training the erectors directly. Now, obviously, the squat itself will strengthen because you are forcing those erectors to work. But if we're looking to, you're not going to be able to consistently increase the loading at the, of the squat unless you get those erectors strong. So doing things like the so-called back extension, which, by the way, really isn't a back extension because we shouldn't be flexing and extending. You should be training the erectors statically, which is the way they're going to be used here. Just as like in a good morning, it's another great exercise where you're increasing the moment arm and thus placing greater stress on the erectors, but you're not going to do a good morning like this, I would hope. So you're going to do a good morning like this, and you're looking to increase the static strength of the musculature. It's also interesting to note that the squat involves significant recruitment of the anterior core musculature. You guys might not know that the squat has significantly greater abdominal activity than the plank. So to say that I'm going to do planks to improve my core for a squat is kind of counterintuitive because you're getting greater activity, which increases with loading. The more load you put on. Now, a body weight squat obviously is not going to do that much, but even that is going to have some, certainly you're going to tighten your core. One of the more important pieces of advice I can give to you as far as maintaining spinal integrity is to use the Valsalva maneuver correctly. And it has been shown that breath holding during the initial ascent of the squat, and we usually teach, okay, as we're coming up, shh, starting your, right, we talk about exhaling on the positive. However, what really the better form for a squat, and particularly when you're starting to increase the loading, where you're going to have increased forces acting upon the joints, increased torques, is to hold breath through the sticking point, and as you're reaching that top, that's where you want to exhale. Breath holding has been shown to create a balloon effect within the core, creating stabilization of the spine. And really, that's the way it should be taught. It's not just like biceps curls, okay, shh, right? We really want to focus here because of the importance of spinal integrity. So let's get into some of the cool research now. So how many of you do deep squats with your clients? How many don't? Okay. I assume you don't, mostly because you think they might be harmful? Okay. Well, a study back in 1961 by Carl Klein, who happened to be affiliated with my alma mater. I was not there in 1961. Just want to make that clear. Not even born. So. Dr. Klein made a lot of headlines with his pioneering research, if you want to call it that, with his studies, and basically he came up with this contraption. It kind of looks like RoboCop a little. And he used this, it was a metal contraption in that he was measuring his athletes and their laxity. And what he showed was that deep squats, the correlation between deep squats and laxity in the collateral and ACL. And Dr. Klein's research caught on like wildfire. He was interviewed for Sports Illustrated. It was like a 7-page layout in Sports Illustrated. When I was doing my research, I actually pulled up that old SI article. It was kind of interesting to read. And he had some very opinionated theories based on his research. And not only was that, did it catch on from a popular standpoint, but it had significant impacts in the health profession. The AMA, the American Medical Association, subsequently came out with a position statement against doing deep knee bends. The Army took it out of its basic training, and many of the schools in New York, where I come from, also took it out of their gym class program. They banned the gym teachers from using deep squats. And the AMAs did it saying that there was a potential for severe injury to the supporting structures of the knee. So that sounds pretty horrible, right? Well, fast forward. Subsequently, people started challenging, as the beautiful thing about research, when you put out research, people are going to challenge your research. And that's what makes research great, is that we don't throw out a piece of research and say, okay, we did that study, and now everyone's going to walk away, and this is it. And there's no such thing. We look at things from different angles, different populations. We try to reproduce the same research to say, hey, did this guy actually carry out his research properly? Well, that was actually done. And there was a study that replicated Klein's protocol to a T using the same device, did not find any evidence of increased forces at the ACL and PCL. And just from a logical standpoint, I talked about the importance of logic in understanding this. Well, and let's go back to our applied anatomy. Remember where the forces at the ACL and PCL are greatest, the shear forces. Anterior forces, greatest, first 30 and 260 degrees, correct. PCL at 90. When you start going past 90, they decrease. So why would you recommend only squatting to here where that's where your greatest PCL forces are? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? And we do want to look at that. Sometimes things we find out through research, logic does not necessarily follow. Well, basically we were able to show here that that wasn't true. I will say also that subsequent, there's been I just cited one study here, and you can, I have I did the point counterpoint it was 2 issues ago, the SCJ on the safety of deep squatting. Are deep squats a safe and viable exercise? And I cited all the literature. If you can hold the questions to the end, I'll get to them. So I quote all the literature there. It is important to know that there have been multiple other studies that have looked at laxity and found no correlation between deep squatting and increased injury and increased laxity in the ACL, PCL. So the question really then becomes, I talked about before as looking at research alone versus the application, the evidence-based guidelines to it. So let's now take this and say, well, do we need to perform? Maybe deep squats aren't that bad for you, but heck, why do I need to do them? And that's actually a good question. So from an athletic standpoint, there is a theory that's been postulated a lot. Zatsiorsky certainly was a champion of it. And personally, I do subscribe to the theory to a degree, and I apply it in my own training, that we should train athletes from a specificity standpoint in the range that they're going to do their activities. So if you're training a basketball player, does a basketball player ever get into a deep squat to jump up or to make a set shot or whatever? No. Basketball players, they're not even coming to 90 degrees. That's their jump. So theoretically, you might say, well, we only need to train them in that range, whereas let's say an alpine skier, they're down here and they're coming out, you want to train them in deep squats. So certainly, if you have someone who is a baseball catcher, et cetera, an athlete, it's a no-brainer that they need to be trained in that range. But how about the athletes that, hey, I'm a volleyball player. I'm not coming down and jumping up like that. Yes, I do subscribe to the theory that from a specificity standpoint that a majority of the training should be carried out in that range. But there also is evidence, research-based evidence, showing that you can increase jumping height through adding deeper squats into the activity. So again, now this is evidence-based practice, has opinion attached to it. And I will talk about the individual variations momentarily after this, but just from a personal standpoint, I would say that a combination of both for the majority of athletes would be good. Maybe for a golfer, not so much. Those are things that you're going to have to, I can give you general guidelines. I can't go through every sport. But what I can tell you is to apply in that there is potential benefit to including both into your routines. Muscle hypertrophy. That's something that is of primary interest to myself. That's the scope of my PhD work, so I do know a thing or two about that. And there are a bunch of studies showing that range of motion, that hypertrophy is related to range of motion. So increased ranges of motion have a positive association with muscle hypertrophy. And again, that lends credence to the point of at least some of the sets should be carried out, if you're looking for hypertrophy of the lower body musculature, in a deep squat fashion. Do all the sets need to be done that way? No, and I can also make a case that because you can increase the loading at limited ranges, those also should be included too. I'm not saying a curtsy squat like you see. I see people loading the bar and they're doing this. But from at least going to parallel, 90 degrees to parallel, by increased loading, you increase the tension on the muscle, and there has been shown to be direct relationships between tension and hypertrophy. This has not been well teased out in the literature. So again, a lot of this is intuitive. You need to understand the research. If you can hold to the end, I'm going to...
What are you referring to as a deep squat?
Deep squat is as low as you can go, basically. So that's getting your butt towards the ground. Now, that will be subjective. I mean, that would be specific to the individual. If you got huge hamstrings and calves, basically the muscle itself is going to prevent you from going lower. Some people can go lower. Certain limitations in joint flexibility are going to obviously mitigate that too. So we'll talk more about that at the end. And finally, in your everyday clients, well, I don't know about you, but I kind of bend down to pick up things a lot, right? And one thing you don't want to do is to have to pick up like this. stoop lifting is associated with injury. So I think that from a functional standpoint, the greatest application perhaps for, at least on the majority of clients, is in your everyday clients. That certainly your everyday clients need to be doing some deep squatting, or else it can not only impair their functional ability, but cause improper movement patterns over time where they're lifting in ways they're not supposed to be lifting. They're going to tend to gravitate. If you're not comfortable squatting like this to lift something up, what are you going to tend to do? You're going to squat in the range you're comfortable in, and you're going to start using joints that shouldn't be used to lift. We're getting there, guys. So I do want to point out that there are contraindications to deep squatting. I'm not saying that everyone should deep squat. Again, the evidence-based approach, we need to take it to its full conclusion. So we can make generalizations, but we always have to apply that to the individual. And the greatest risk of injury, as I mentioned earlier, in compression, when you have the two forces going, it's the menisci and the articular cartilage. The articular cartilage is surrounding the femur and the tibia, which are coming in together as it's doing, and it's been shown that that can potentially get stressed. The menisci, which provide a cushion between the two, also are under greater load. If you have injury, if there is arthritis or menisci injury, that probably is a contraindication to deep squatting. And those are things you want to talk to a physical therapist about. Hopefully that person, if they have injuries such as this, are working with a physical therapist or have worked with a physical therapist who can give you info. And also, the patellofemoral stresses are significantly increased. So there is potential injury to the patella structure from pressing up. Again, when you're coming down, the patella is forced onto the femur and thus is under higher stresses. So things like patellofemoral degeneration, chondromalacia of the knee, and thus the general overriding advice I can give here is to consider the individual's pathologic condition, and when in doubt, refer it out. Interesting study done. I'm sure we've all heard, never let those knees travel past the toes. I see trainers saying all the time, hey, knees past the toes. And it's kind of like, well, there's this magic point where all of a sudden, if my knees hit here, okay, here, that doesn't happen. It's not like you just hit that magic bullet and all of a sudden your knees explode. Interestingly, Andy Fry, very good researcher, did a study back in 2005, had 7 recreationally trained subjects do squatting, and he had it was a within subject design. Same subjects did both protocols. So he had them squat unrestricted, as you see here, and then he put up a board so that their knees could not go. A very novel design. I think a really well-designed study. What did he find? Well, restricting the knees, as you might expect, restricting forward translation of the knees, decreased the torque at the knee. That's good, right? Problem is that it increased the forces at the spine, and also it changed the kinematics. As you can see here, kind of doesn't look like great form going on there at that spine. Is that trade-off worth it? Probably not. Certainly in my book it's not. The spine is much less able to withstand the greater forces, and you really start to get into problems, especially under heavier load, when you're trying to restrict knee motion. So bottom line is there is not some magic bullet point where the knees pass the toes that you're going to all of a sudden run into danger. Obviously, you also don't want someone pushing forward at the knees where that would just be proper form. But having natural knee motion with squatting should be a natural motion. Different people are going to have, and one thing I do want to point out is that form in squatting will be different from person to person. We all have different structures. Look around the room. So people that have longer legs are going to have, obviously their knees are going to tend to traverse further forward just because of their body structure. You need to take that into account. Is that going to be harmful? I can't answer that. It depends on the person, depends on their pathologic condition. Do they have any injuries? Other things need to be considered. Gaze, we talk about where should the person look when we're squatting. Well, a great study was done several years ago showing that they gave 3 gaze positions, down, straight ahead, and up. showed that downward gaze increased spinal flexion by almost 5 degrees. Makes sense, right? You start doing this, what happens? Well, it makes you start to stoop. We don't want that. So the general rule of thumb, we either look straight ahead or slightly upward. By the way, they didn't look at this, but that makes sense. You don't want to also look like this where you start getting a lot of strain at the neck. You shouldn't be squatting like this either. And finally is bar position. So when we talk about bar position, there's two basic back squat positions, and then of course we have the front squat position. With the back squat, you have a high bar position. High bar position has been shown to have greater knee extensor torque and less hip extensor torque. Well, take a look at the squat versus this. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure that one out, right? Look at the hip here, look at the hip here. So you certainly, with this lower bar squat, get greater hip, and here you're getting greater knee. Which one is better? Depends. By the way, my favorite phrase in fitness, it depends. Because virtually every question you can ask me, I can answer with, it depends. And it does, because each client is different. What's their goals? Jim had talked earlier about knowing what your goal is in a client. It's real important, isn't it? And studies also show that the front squat, first of all, you're going to load less in the front squat, so of course torque is going to tend to go down. But you're going to reduce compressive forces at the knee and also at the spine. So one thing, if you're having clients that are finding it difficult on their back, even with back problems, by giving them front squats, I've done a lot of work with front squats. I love the front squat. It can reduce the issues with back, lower back issues specifically, or even mid-back, and thus allow clients to squat better. And by the way, obviously dumbbells, there's other squatting techniques we can do too. And there has been some studies showing that you get greater quad activation. So you're going to reduce gluteal activation, increase quad activation. Is that something you want to do? It depends. So we'll wrap up here with stance. Studies show that a narrow stance results in greater gastrocnemius activity and to some degree greater quadriceps activity. It also has been shown to increase forward translation. So when I have a narrow stance, I'm going to tend to go further forward. For those who have knee issues, it might become a problem. You might not want to have them doing narrow stance squats. Wider stance increases glute max activation and also increases adductor activation. So again, we can then use squats. The beauty of this that we use the tools to our advantage and more importantly to the client's advantage. What is that client looking for? Well, we have the power to adjust the squat to achieve what we want to accomplish. And foot position, there has been shown that an external rotation increases adductor activation. Would kind of make sense, right? When you're doing this, you're forcing the adductors to work from coming in. So the most important point with foot position is that you want to have your knees tracking over your toes. If you're starting to get into a position where that's not going to be natural, you don't want to do that squat. So when you start getting to a point where the knees don't track properly, you're going to increase the potential for knee injuries. And for further info on this, you can consult I mentioned earlier, I did a 2010 review article on the topic called Squatting Kinematics and Kinetics and Their Application to Exercise Performance. So I do think we have any time?